Hey guys, what's going on? Today's topic that we're going to be discussing is what is the purpose of long toss? How should I do it? Should I be using it? And how will it affect me or help me with my baseball career? Today, our panelist looks very similar to what we had last time with some other special additions. We'll rattle through real quick. We have Dr. Brandon Erickson again, Dr. Robbie Williams, Dr. Rob Andrews, Adam Smith, Brett Corneris, Henry Davis, Joe LaSorsa, and Dr. Robin Lund. Henry Davis is a catcher at the University of Louisville, has arguably one of the best arms in the country. Joe LaSorsa is a pitcher in the Rays organization for this is going into his sophomore year. Well, what would have been our sophomore year here in the Rays organization. And Dr. Robin Lund is a pitching coach at the University of Iowa. As we stated, today's topic is going to be long toss. And sometimes this is a very controversial topic in terms of how it can affect mechanics, what players should be doing it, how often should they be doing it. And we hope to today really dig deep and figure out exactly what's going to be the best scenario for each athlete, whether you're a pitcher, a catcher, so on and so forth, and how you can hopefully then apply it. Adam, I'm going to start off with you, and I would just like you to shed some light on what you view long toss as, why certain people do it, and potentially what's even done at the professional level. As we know, Adam is a strength coach for the AAA Angels.
Yeah, absolutely. From a strength coach perspective, I see a lot of benefits in it in terms of training when I look at it purely from that side. I mean, from physics and physiology side of it, I see it as basically a triplanar plyometric movement, that's highly sport specific. Transfer to training there, taking the forces that you're able to produce in the weight room and then transfer it to that. So I think that it's huge with that. I think that it teaches the body to transfer force better because it's experiencing higher forces. So, you're essentially getting momentum from your lower half and getting movements there. And then you're able to transfer up the training, which essentially teaches your pelvis to move at a higher velocity. It teaches your torso to move at a higher velocity. And then it teaches your arm to move at a higher velocity. So then from kind of if you have a little bit of a track background, it's along the same concepts of like overspeed training and that kind of stuff. Then from more of a motor behavior aspect, it teaches your body to be able to handle a little bit of degrees of variability when you're throwing, which there is some aspects that are important to that. And that's again one of the controversial things of how much variability do you want when you're working with throwing and delivery and that kind of stuff. And then for me, my biggest benefit that I think that it does is that front leg, because you're getting momentum going into it. That front leg has to absorb such high forces that it does have to absorb high force when you pitch, but now you're experiencing even higher forces because now you're creating momentum going into that front side. And we do know that the front side does play a big role in producing force, and the more force that you're able to handle on that front side, there is a correlation to velocity there. So for those three aspects there, I think that it's huge, and it's highly used in professional baseball. It's dependent on the guy. We have a wide range of guys. We have 16-year-old Latino guys. We have 30, 40-year-old dudes, and each one kind of has developed their program along with long toss. I'd say that the majority of guys have some type of long toss in their repertoire. I mean, you talk about someone like Fernando Rodney that I just saw this past year, and the dude's like 40, and he's out there long tossing like minimal effort. And I was like, dude, I got to talk to this guy. So I go over, talk to him, like, dude, like, what's your deal? You're 40, you're long tossing. He's like, this is what's worked for me. I've done this since I was, a teenager. I long toss close to all year round. I'm not saying that that's what everyone does. I'm not saying that that's ideal. Obviously, I think that you need to manage workloads, and then you look at kind of acute to chronic workloads when you're talking about that. What are guys used to in terms of going to that stuff? But so I'd say he's more on the long end of the spectrum. And there's some guys who haven't done long toss as much, but it's all over the board in the pro realm, but the majority of guys do incorporate some type of long toss into their programs.
Awesome, man. What an unbelievable introduction here to this talk. And those three specifics, I'm sure everybody is going to hit on an element of those three areas that you brought up. I know Dr. Robin Lund is going to talk about acute to chronic workload on the arm and how that interacts. So I'm sure we're going to have a varying talks built off of that. Great job. Thank you for bringing that up to the table. I'm going to go to, Dr. Erickson, if you'd like to bring up, just start us off with what some of the research says in terms of, long toss and exactly, what are there protocols that have been brought into place or so on and so forth?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that, honestly, from my perspective, a lot of the guys in this call know more about long toss than I do, because usually what I say is start a throwing progression, right? And the throwing progression starts out at 60 feet, sometimes 45, walk it back to 60, walk it back to 90, walk it back to 120. Meanwhile, the whole time it's lofted, and then we kind of start to go on a rope and start backing it up. And then it's kind of person dependent after you get past 120. There are some guys that stretch it out to 180, 200, 300 feet. And there are other guys that don't really like to stretch it out past 120. If you look at some of the data that's out there, some of the studies actually use that modus sleeve, so that sleeve that goes on the arm with the gyrometer in it. And basically what it does is it tells you your elbow valgus or your elbow bear's torque, basically, so the amount of stress on the inside of your elbow when you're throwing a baseball. And so we know that the sleeve's not perfect, but it does a pretty good job of giving us some reliable data from throw to throw. The magnitude of the data may not be necessarily accurate, but it's pretty consistent for each person. So it can give us an idea of how much stress that particular person's putting on their arm, not necessarily the overall stress they're putting on, but how much stress they're putting on from a pitch to pitch. So if you're talking about being 75% or 80% of their max, it can give us that idea. And so we know that when guys get out to about 120 feet or get a little bit further than that, you put about the same amount of stress on your elbow as you do when you're throwing off a mound, is what some of the studies out of Alabama and some of the other studies that came out of HSS have shown. So there's actually people that talk about, well, do we let guys throw off a mound sooner? Because if they're putting enough stress on their elbow at 120 feet to be throwing off a mound, should we let them progress to a mound sooner in their throwing program? I would tell you, for me personally, I don't have a problem with guys getting out 120, 150. The guys who really want to get out to 200 and plus, I do worry about that a little bit, only because if you start to get sloppy when you're throwing that far, you really start to change the mechanics on your shoulder and elbow. If you're practicing good form while you're doing it, it's fine. But if you're starting to get a little sloppy, or you're not paying attention as much as you're throwing, I don't want you to have it, to re-injure yourself or flare something up when you're trying to throw a little bit too far, trying to stretch yourself out a little too far. So I think most of the guys who get injured know themselves and know when they should stop stretching it out, and know when they should progress to the next phase.
Excellent. Dr. Lund, can you speak a little bit to, I know a lot of your protocols involve the modus sleeve, which Dr. Erickson was just referencing. So if you wouldn't mind, can you just speak a little bit to how you're using that modus sleeve to then create some of that long toss programming?
Yeah, so our guys use it every day. And right now we're building some tools. So when you say what we're using right now, we're in the process of building some custom tools, but essentially you alluded to tracking the AC ratio. So for those of you listening, if you're not familiar with that, your acute workload is your average workload that you've been doing on a daily basis over the last 7 days. So it's kind of like what you're used to doing, like what you're currently doing right now from a workload standpoint. And then the chronic would be your average daily workload over the last month. So that's kind of what you're accustomed to, or your fitness level. So again, acute, what are you doing today? What are you doing currently? And chronic is kind of like your fitness level. And you want those ratios to stay relative within a band, if you will. And so for us, we do long toss test, and we get a sense of how much stress is placed on each individual at all those distances. So 90, 120, 150, 180, so on and so forth. And we have guys that will long toss all the way up to 300 feet quite regularly. And basically what we can do then is we can use some custom software to basically write programs. And we can just say, hey, we want X, player X to have X amount of workload today. And the software will just kind of customize and write a program for them.
Excellent. So, when we're talking about, Dr. Erickson brought up these adjustments to the mechanics, right? And how potentially these can be flawed. And Dr. Lund, you and I were talking yesterday at length with regard to how the mechanics actually at the shorter distances tend to be a lot more varied from our normal throwing mechanics than actually these further out ones, simply for the fact that I don't need to generate as much velocity to get the ball there. So, can you speak just a little to how you have then tailored even your short throws?
Yeah, for us, like, I think there's you basically where your arm is in position, kind of to the world at weight and loading, at weight bearing heel plant. You're gonna have a lot more variability at lower intent throwing is my contention. So if you're throwing, say, at 40 or 50%, or you're making a double play feed like an infielder, that lead foot can be down and the forearm can be pointing down, and you're safe. I mean, you're going to be fine. You're not generating that much torque, and we see that all the time. But with higher intent throwing, we're going to want the point, or where the location of the arm is at weight bearing heel plant, to be in a much tighter kind of narrow band with the high intent throwing. And so what I've noticed, just, if you're throwing really, really hard, whether it be long toss or whatever, for our guys, the guys that have clean arms and have good timing, they're real tight. They all seem to be in the same position at the same time, and it's relatively consistent.
And, I would venture to say, Dr. Erickson, you probably meant the exact same thing. We need high intent throwing. And by intent, we're really talking about focus on hitting the target and going on and so on and so forth like that, with each one of these throws. And we'll probably prevent ourselves from getting in any of these poor positions during that time.
Yeah, I think that's super important. I think you brought up a great point, Robin. I think even when you're playing catch, if you look at some of the studies that clubs have done just kind of internally that aren't necessarily published, but if you're just playing catch and you're not actually going through the motions properly, you're kind of being lackadaisical about it, you actually can really significantly increase the stress on your shoulder and elbow, more so than if you're throwing out to 90, 120, or 180. So I think the point is great that if you're going to go out and throw with a purpose. Make sure you're paying attention to what you're doing. Even if you're just playing catch, make sure you're going through the motions like you normally do, because you'll actually stress your shoulder and elbow a lot more if you're not.
Absolutely. So now that we've heard sort of both of those interactions in terms of what research says, and then actually what Dr. Lund is then creating his own research around and data tracking, we've heard a little back and forth in terms of, what some of the research says and then actually what's happening in reality. Dr. Williams, would you like to step in here and talk about some of the other research in terms of, distances and so on and so forth with regard to these mechanics?
Yeah, and I think a lot of that's already been stated in regards to, we know once an athlete gets to about 120 feet, it's very similar in terms of the amount of forces in the elbow as throwing off of a mound. But I think where other technologies and specialties become important with this is, we know not every single person is going to distribute the same amount of force at 120 feet. So each person is going to be a little different. And so that's where I think in more individualized programs, you can get specific with guys in regards to their workload and the long toss distance that they can go out to. But purely me, I'm in this for a rehabilitation standpoint. Especially working at the major league level, you're working with a variety of different professionals with different expertise in areas. And so certainly I'm in daily communication with the pitching coach, the medical director, the athletic trainers. We're all collaborating on what that player's workload is going to specifically be for that day. I'm there to make sure appropriately, as they get to about 120 feet, that they're in the knowledge that, okay, they're showing, in your opinion, and when I say your opinion, I mean the pitching coaches, that they're not showing any compensations. The player's feeling well throwing at about 120 feet, and once they're able to deliver that on more of a line, then kind of I will slowly start to step aside. And then as they start to work more towards mound throwing and things like that, then they're going to work more directly with the pitching coach. And if they need to make mechanical adjustments, they're going to be doing that one-on-one. I'm just there to observe workload, making sure that they're recovering well and that they're not feeling symptoms that are out of the normal with what they would do kind of on a daily program. And we want to do that as safely as possible and getting the athlete back onto the mound in a progressive manner.
Excellent. Sorry. Thank you. Coach Brett, I'm going to bring you in here. Can you give us some of the gaps that might potentially exist in some of the research that's been put out on long toss?
Yeah, I think that there are a few things that you have to address with just research in general. And I think the first also is the disconnect between the actual researchers and the research that's getting put out, and then coaches at all different levels, right? So we have a group of individuals here who are highly motivated, who are working with high-level athletes a lot of the time. But if we think about the high school coaches, even the lower-level collegiate coaches, old-school pitching coaches, people that aren't privy to this research, there's a big disconnect in the information that they have, that they have at their disposal. So I think part of our disconnect that we need to fill the gap is disseminating this information to the coaches at these different levels. And then the next aspect is also just gaps in the actual research, and all research creates more questions, right? And that's a very good thing. But so if we know that arm angle decreases, elbow varus torque increases with long tossing, is that necessarily a bad thing, right? I mean, in certain circumstances, it might be a good thing, just like overloading over speed, like Adam had mentioned, is a good thing as well. So for something with like the Motus sleeve, for instance, it talks about arm angle with the forearm in relation to the ground, but it doesn't necessarily talk about torso angle, head position. So you're just talking about the position of the forearm in relation to the ground. So how does torso angle, hip rotation change according to those things? And I think these are all things that we have to take with a grain of salt. We take the data that we have, and then we do things like what Dr. Lund is doing, where you create a program, you monitor every single aspect of data, and if you are privy to that information, you can then start to fill in some of the gaps with what the research is creating.
Excellent. Yeah. Certainly the case that, oftentimes it's how consumable can we make information, right? And that's pretty much, in a nutshell, probably our biggest issue with research is that while there can be several pockets of individuals that can understand it, it becomes very difficult to make it mass consumable and then get that information out there in an easy fashion. So let's take a step back from sort of the research realm. And then even Dr. Lund is in a very, let's call it controlled environment, in the sense that all of his athletes are under his control and under his guides in terms of what their throwing regimen is going to be. And let's take it now a little bit more into what some of our athletes have experienced. Joe, I'm gonna call on you in terms of how long toss has impacted your life, and then what sort of programs you've used along the way.
Well, I try to do it as much as possible. I was always a big believer in long toss. I love doing long toss. I love stretching the arm out. But I never go outside of like my boundaries for that. Like I never just will push myself, and it's like, and then it gets to the point where instead of my arms here, I'm throwing where it's like I'm like that. I always try to stay within the realm of my pitching motion. And I always like the little side shuffle that comes with it. I like the transferring of energy like that. I mean, I'm always really good at it. I always try to do like 3 or 4 times, like really stretching it out, and then I always do pull downs. Yet for some reason, I'm really good with doing that motion, but then once it comes onto the mound from a static point, I have trouble transferring that motion to a mound to have the same type of correlation and velocity. But other than that, the long toss, it's really I love it, and never really felt any problems with my arm. If I did feel a problem with my arm going into long toss, it would always just go away after I did it. Like once I just started throwing, stretching it out, and like getting the external back and whatnot, it would always just go away, and then it would be like, oh, it's gone, I guess. So, yeah.
Thank you, Joe. It's quite impressive too to hear an athlete go through why they like it, and what it really does for them. And it's almost as if, Joe, you're using it to sort of cleanse your arm and still feel powerful with your arm. And I would venture to say, knowing you, when you veer away from stuff like that, it also has somewhat of a reverse psychology effect on you, in the sense that if you haven't been able to long toss, you then have this sensation that, oh my God, I can't throw hard as hard anymore, and I need to get back to this, and so on and so forth. Henry, I'm going to call on you next, and just like you to shed some light on sort of your path with long toss and what that's really meant for your career.
So when I first started when I was 15, and I was okay at baseball, but not very good. Didn't have any like crazy tools or anything. And one of the dads of one of my teammates said to me, if you can throw 300 feet, you can throw 90. And I said, okay. Literally the next day, I went to the football field, bucket of balls, and tried to throw the ball as far as I could, and I got 70 yards. I was like, all right, I'm coming back tomorrow. And I came back the next day and the next day, and for 3 weeks, and my arm was hanging the entire time, just through and through and through. And I got to like 84 yards, and then I just kept doing it, and I decreased a little bit in the frequency, but I still probably went 5 days out of the week, and I just threw and I threw and I threw. And I remember the hardest velocity I got before long tossing was 81 on a crow hop. And then after probably 4 weeks of doing it, I got 86, and I was like, all right, that's awesome. The quick results just like fired me up even more. I was like, I can do better. I started throwing again. I got to 100 yards. I got to like 105, and this time I didn't have a radar gun. Come springtime, I buy a radar gun, and the frequency of my long toss kind of diminished a little bit because we were practicing and stuff. But I remember one of my teammates was like, I said, I could definitely throw 90 right now. I can throw 100 yards. And he said, no way. So I did a run and gun, and I got 94. So that's the spring, and I was 16. This is like 6 months later. So I went from 81 to 94 in basically 6 months. So the season ends, the high school season, and I just long toss and I long toss and I long toss. And I literally do it every day. And I got to the point where I could throw from the back of the end zone through the other field goal. So probably 130 yards. And at this point, I'm still really skinny. I'm like 170 pounds, 6 foot. And it comes to summer ball. And my coach says, let's see how hard you can throw. So I went to the outfield, and I run and gun, and I literally got 101. And I was like, wow, like I just went in basically 14 months from 81 to 101. And then like a couple days later, I got 104. And then like the following spring, much later, when I kind of realized I was at a good point, I said, okay, going to decrease the long toss. Randomly, I'm throwing in my basement just in a normal 3 times a week circuit, and I hit 106. And I was like, oh my gosh, I wish I got that on video. And then kind of just said, I'm going to really focus that same energy on hitting and defense now.
Excellent. Obviously a crazy story, probably more going on there about what's going on between your ears than what's happening physiologically to that arm in terms of just sheer willpower to get there. I'm going to call on Dr. Andrews because I know, you really want to jump in here just based off of Henry's story and, just let you shed some light. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think, well, just as a physical therapist, hearing what Henry just said scares the hell out of me. Someone going long tossing every day for months, but personally, I'm all for long toss. I think a lot of people, a lot of therapists are not. I think part of that is, we don't really have a definition for what long toss is, right? I mean, I think there was even a study a few years ago where they gave a questionnaire to, I think it was 5 different MLB organizations, and they gave it to all of the pitchers, pitching coaches, and athletic trainers. And the pitchers and the pitching coaches were all kind of on on the same page, more or less, where they all thought that pitching was more, throwing on an arc, They were kind of 50-50 if there should be a crow hop or not. The athletic trainers were, they were kind of just all across the board. If it's more on a line, with a crow hop, without a crow hop, on an arc with crow hop, without a crow hop. So I don't think we really know. We don't have a true definition of what long tossing even is. But kind of going off what Henry said a little bit, again, I think the long toss is fine. I think if we are kind of doing it, I say sub-maximally, not going max effort, max distance every throw, I think there's nothing wrong with that. I think you can strengthen anything sub-maximally. What scares me, one thing to consider at least is long tossing during the season. Again, nothing wrong with it, but if say a starting pitcher, if throwing past 120 feet is essentially the same as putting the same stress as throwing off the mound, now you have a guy pitching a game, probably long tossing before that game, pitching a game, maybe long tossing, twice in between those starts, throwing 2 bullpens in between those starts, long tossing again before that game. It's just a lot of throwing. So again, I think if you don't, long toss for distance, for max effort, for max distance, I'm okay with it. But I just think from the fatigue standpoint in longevity, ASMI did a study, the number one risk factor for an elbow injury is elbow fatigue. Pitching with elbow fatigue, 36 times more likely to have an elbow injury. So, my take, I like it. I think it's, as Adam said before, it's an athletic movement. I think it finds a good, just a different arm slot, a little bit more free motion. Your intent is different. And I think it helps to increase your arm speed, not so much your arm strength, but your arm speed and maybe endurance. But I think it has to be used, with caution, basically.
And listen, so it sounds like your ability is going to really end up dictating your distance, right? But what we're really bringing into question, based on what you're discussing there, Rob, is what is the volume or what is the intent behind that? Coach Brett, would you like to shed some light on that? And then Dr. Lund, I'm going to come to you next after Coach Brett to just speak to how you're managing sort of intent.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a quick point that there's a lot of research on our perception of effort as well, right? So if you go and tell me throw 50% of your max at 60 feet or whatever that is that I am going to be absolutely terrible at understanding what my 50% is. And Coach Nick, we've thrown with people on these return to throwing programs where it says 50%. And we're thinking in our head, if this is your 50%, then I'm working with the next Aroldis Chapman because you're throwing 120 miles per hour, essentially, based on what their 50% is.
Yeah, so my favorite is when they hit you with an 80, right, square in the chest and at 50%.
Right, exactly. And so it is very hard to structure these programs as well because you build in these percentages that make so much sense in terms of a ramping standpoint, right? And long tossing is going to be the same thing. But if they're unable to dictate what percentage they're actually throwing, you need data. And that's where the Modus sleeve and what Dr. Lund is doing, I think, will connect right back into this because you have hard and fast data. You probably have a max velocity or effort that they're throwing. So you can say down to the miles per hour what percentage of effort they're putting in on every single throw.
Absolutely. Dr. Lund, do you want to give a little insight there as to how you're managing intent and effort?
Yeah, I mean, for us, from an intent standpoint, I follow the lead of Charlie Francis, the late Charlie Francis, the track and field coach, where we do basically what we call a high-low method. We want our guys either throwing with really high intent on a given day, and then and the other days we want them throwing with very low intent, and we try to avoid those medium days. And so when I say intent, I'm referring to intensity, right? Like how hard I'm actually throwing, and then the volume obviously will vary over the year. So I think you can throw at a high intent early in a program as long as your volume is lower. And then what we're hoping is we can slowly build up tolerance to more higher and higher volumes of that high intent. But the bottom line for us is if you're trying to throw hard and you're trying to build what I'd call arm strength, you gotta avoid those medium days. You want high intent because that's kind of the neuromuscular stimulus that we need to kind of adapt and throw harder. And then on the low days, we need them to be really low so that you can actually recover and have another high intent day following that. It's those medium days are what are in my opinion, are what get the athlete and what really blunt growth, because it's not enough of a stimulus to actually adapt and throw harder, but it's too much to recover properly. So we try to avoid those medium days.
Excellent point there. And so obviously the undulation of this is where we're hoping to find that happy medium. And I think, Robbie, you were really indicating a lot of that too, Dr. Andrews, in terms of, not having a max effort day every single day. And I think Henry, I'm sure has matured in terms of his experience and then knowledge of even himself and his own arm, has probably adjusted his program over time, as he even indicated that he started to scale back on some of his throwing routines and how much long toss he was actually doing. Henry, you want to shed some light on what your current program is?
Yeah, so for college season, for people who don't know, it's you play Tuesday and then you play Friday, Saturday, Sunday. So this season I was actually catching most of the games a week. I might get one off here and there. So I would actually long toss Thursday and then play through the series, and I would catch with the pitchers, and they either would go to like 300 or 270, whatever they personally felt was best for them to get loose for the game. And then I would go through the whole games, and then on Monday I would long toss with the other catcher, and then Tuesday we'd play, and then on Wednesday I would go like probably 100 feet, just get loose for practice.
Interesting. So, and I'm curious there, Dr. Lund, and then anybody else who wants to chime in. It's quite interesting how he's almost viewing then the game as like his downtime and his recovery period, simply because most of the throws he's going to make in the game, with the exception of maybe one or two of your warm-up throws, and then if you have to throw anybody out in that game, are going to be light.
Yeah, I mean, position players have a completely different deal. Like at Iowa, our position guys play long toss every day. They won't go. They're not going to make like 30 throws, but they're going to get out to what they feel is a max distance, make a handful of throws, and then start working back in. And it's brutal, but if they can't do that, then they can't play for us, because they need to be able, like your position guy, you got to be able to throw every day. Now, again, like I said, you're not throwing the volume that, like, say, our pitchers would do, but they are essentially playing long toss every day at a much smaller volume. Our pitchers play long toss every time they throw a pen. They play long toss before they pitch in a game, and they usually have a third long toss session sometime in the week. So our pitchers were shooting for 3 times a week.
Awesome. 3 times of long toss a week. And then on those long toss days, correct me if I'm wrong, but you undulate them slightly as well. Yes?
Yeah. So yeah, our guys will go out to their max distance, and then make a few compression throws on the way in, and then they would throw their pen. On the non-game or bullpen days, they typically don't make compression throws. They just do extension only typically. And then on a game day, same thing. They're going to go out to a certain distance. They're going to compress back and then get into the mound, get ready for the game.
Again, by compression throws, just to put that out there, he means pull downs.
Pulling down on the way back. Exactly. Yep.
Joe, can you shed a little light on how different your long toss regimen might be than, let's say, compared to what Dr. Lund just outlined, or even Henry's, and especially obviously the difference being not only at the pro level, but also on occasions being out of the pen or being in a spot start?
Yeah, well, I'm still looking for that spot start right now, but out of the pen, it's really difficult because I know in season we're not allowed 2 long toss. The max we're about to go is about 120, and that's if they know like you really want to stretch it out. So they don't allow you to long toss because you're throwing every day. And it's interesting because when I was doing that in the season, I was finding this past season in the summer of 2019, I was seeing how my velocity was going up. even though I was long tossing less, but I was throwing more from like the 60-90 range, and I was throwing a lot and very frequent. And I noticed that like the more I was throwing and the more max effort I was doing on that, like my velocity was going up with less strength and conditioning and less long toss, with also my like weight going down as well. So I wasn't really sure what was going on. It was just working. It was very weird. Um, all the long toss that I do comes in the off season, and that's on me dictating it on what I want to do, because our programs basically are throw 5 to 6 days a week. You're throwing for 12 to 15 minutes, and the max they want you to go is like 120 to 180 feet. That's off-season work max, building up to spring training. So I really wasn't about that, because I was like, there's no way this is going to get my arm in shape, because I'm always a big believer in long toss. So I thought, well, I'm just going to long toss, and being from the Northeast, obviously you have to do it into a net. So it's more about just like your power output and your angle that you're throwing into a net from about 5 to 10 feet away when you're releasing it, as opposed to like getting onto a field and throwing it and like really see the ball sailing. So, you know, and then once spring training came around, it was more so, it was kind of the same thing. And it was like I was shifting away from what I was doing the whole off season, preparing myself for how my arm was. And then I found that they basically wanted us to throw from like a 90 to 120 foot range every day with no pull downs, just like stretching it out and like kind of the same distance. And it was weird, because then I was finding that like it was conditioning my arm to be really well, but I wasn't getting that like power output. And it's weird, because then when you are a long reliever that has to throw very frequently, it's like you kind of just have to save your bullets for the game, because on like a Wednesday where you're feeling good and you want to stretch it out, but like you're probably going to come out of the pen Thursday and throw for 3 or 4 innings, it's like, well, I kind of can't do that because I have to save my bullets. So it kind of gets into that perspective.
Interesting stuff there. I mean, does anybody want to speak to the fact that, so as his volume went up, and in terms of how frequent he was throwing, right? And he wanted to, and I know Dr. Lung, you're a big believer in this, you want the most intent, or the most taxing day to be on the mound. And it seems as though Joe was being regulated to something very similar, obviously not allowing him to have his long toss throughout. But what I think is interesting, and I would love if somebody would shed light on this, but the frequency of how often he was throwing and at these specific distances, and with these similar mechanics, all of a sudden he started to improve when then taking it to a mound. So it sounds like we may have had less of a neurological improvement and potentially more of a motor learning improvement.
I'd like to sort of add something in there too. And I think one thing that Joe touched on, which we can't discredit, is the mental aspect of disrupting or changing a pitcher's habits, right? And Joe had even said, well, you know, I don't like that, because I personally love to long toss. And I think that's something that can be discredited as well. But I think you can almost compare this to like a dynamic effort program with strength and conditioning, right? Where you have different amounts of, like, one day your max effort might be a flat ground, the next day it might be a long toss, one day it might be a mound. And I think there's probably different philosophies as to how that works, and that you're trying to transfer dynamic efforts and all different sorts of skill to your eventual skill, right? So if you're a power lifter and you're looking to increase the back squat, you're going to do a lot of different variations of a squat to hopefully transfer to that. I think that's just one mode of thinking. But I'd be interested to hear how having just one max effort day and being that on the mound all the time works out versus dynamic effort days, with different exercises or variations of the same skill.
Excellent. Yeah. Anybody else, if they want to jump in on that topic there, but Adam, go ahead.
There we go. Yeah. So, and I kind of want to ask, Dr. Lund too, on his, with the transfer to the mound, because that was something that Joe had mentioned earlier. And it is something that I do see with some guys, is that when they do start to create like a huge separation between like velo from from long toss to velo on the mound, I have noticed that guys will, when they do tend to get away from long toss, then the velo will come up. I don't know if that's because now they're working from more of a static position, similar to on the mound, or if it's because of becoming more efficient in those specific mechanics. And I mean, it kind of plays into like some strength conditioning stuff too, where like if the dude's more elastic, right, where he's able to do more force and jump higher off of more elastic, plyometric type of work, but they have, trouble producing forces at like low velocities, that I'm wondering, if there is something there to where if someone is now had the ability to create like that neuromuscular output at the velocities, but now that they would bring it into a more static movement and tone in the efficiency of the movement pattern. Whereas I think too in the other direction, where it's like guys that don't have much of a separation at all between long toss and the mound velo, I have seen some of those dudes be able to increase that mound velo more with going into the long toss. I don't know if that it was confusing, but it's basically a little bit of individualization there of guys powering up that system and being a little bit more elastic with it, and then taking it to a more static environment to get that transfer of training. And I want to see if Dr. Lund had anything about if you've noticed like guys that get a huge separation between their long toss velo and mound velo, and if they need to come back to more static work, or what your opinion was on that.
Yeah, we don't see too many guys that separate like that, but we also don't let the guys use a lot of momentum with their long toss. You know what I mean? So we don't run and gun at all, and it's not that I think they're unsafe or any reason. It's just that I feel like get very toe dominant, right? The faster you're moving and the more momentum you have, the more toe dominant you get, and then it stops looking like pitching and it looks more like an outfielder's throw. And so we get very low momentum in the long toss. So again, we don't see that. But what I hear you saying, and I agree with you 100%, is throwing is how hard you throw is a very multifactorial problem. There's guys that, think the answer to your question is, where's the low hanging fruit? Some guys will see a big jump just by gaining weight, getting a little bit of strength. Some guys will see a big jump by moving more efficiently in the lower half. Some guys will see a big jump by improving mobility. Some guys just by throwing more from a motor learning or organizing a little bit better. So it's kind of a cop-out answer, but I don't see too much separation. What I see with long toss is a really strong correlation between distance, max distance, and mound. I see a better correlation there than I do with, say, run and gun velocity.
What's very interesting too, let's just taking it into a mechanic standpoint. Generally, when you see that gap, like Dr. Lund is talking about, there tends to be a significant issue in terms of backside mechanics. When you have somebody that can long toss the distance they're supposed to be able to long toss to equate out to the miles per hour, but it's just not equating on the mound, chances are that momentum has altered their lower half mechanics enough so that they can't transfer that back now to the mound. And just some of the stuff that I've read and watched video on, it's compared a lot of the lower half mechanics, especially backside, in terms of what they're able to do in their long toss as compared to their mound velo. I think Henry actually has a great analogy for this to literally explain what's going on in terms of that exact scenario.
Yeah. So Brandon Neek is a pitcher who is now at UVA, and him and I are still really close, and he was my main throwing partner through the whole long toss thing. And he similarly had a jump from like 76 to 94 in about the same window, and we were on almost the same plan. And the difference was, when I would run and gun, I could get into the low 100s and he would hit 94. And then Brandon off a mound was also 94. But whenever my high school coach would ask me to throw off the mound, I would be like 79 to 82 and throw the ball to the backstep every time.
which again speaks to his ability to transfer those mechanics from not having momentum to then, or excuse me, from having momentum to not having momentum, and the way in which they really alter for Henry on the mound. At the end of this, I do have one of his videos of him hitting 101, and we'll be able to watch it all together. I'll share my screen and we can go through and we can dissect the mechanics there. But I'll tell you right now, if he could get himself to throw like that off of a mound, we wouldn't have an issue. But there is a distinct difference in terms of what his mechanics look like from a standstill as compared to what they look like on his run and gun, or even potentially on his long toss, which speaks a lot to how should we be managing then our mechanics in terms of long tossing, right? We've and again, I want to open this up to everybody. Really, it's, we've read the studies that state that they can change mechanics drastically, right? We've then read the other studies that have come out and stated, nah, they don't really change them that much. Then there's other philosophies that are, well, why is changing my mechanics or varying my mechanics periodically that detrimental to me? Has that ever been proven to really cause significant injury? So there's a lot of different variations and different camps there. And I'm really just curious to get everybody's sort of input into, how should I, or what do I think is going to be the best course of action in terms of long tossing? Listen, I think everybody would venture to say that, if I can do it with as little momentum as possible and throw the ball 310 yards or 310 feet, that's going to be a lot more beneficial than me having to sprint to that position and then throw that ball 310 feet. But curious to anybody in terms of just their thoughts on what it really does to our mechanics, and is there any detrimental change that is going on?
I think I'll answer your question with a question that I was actually going to ask before, and then maybe try at least give some experience on the answer. But I was going to say the same thing, is that, is there any data that really shows that if you throw from multiple arm slots, are you doing any more damage to your arm than if you throw repetitively from one? And, I know all the pitching coaches that I've been exposed to, it's repetition of form. And I know a lot of that is so you're not cueing the batter, right? So every pitch looks the same. But if you can throw a fastball from 3 different arm slots, a slider from 3 different arm slots, are you doing more damage necessarily to your arm than if you were to just throw from one slot all the time? So can a little bit of variability actually save muscle damage or ligament damage? I don't know the answer to that, and I'm curious to if anybody does. But I think the other thing to answer your question is, pitching is very much a skill, right? So especially when we're coaching young athletes, do we focus on the skill of pitching or making them better athletes first? And I think you almost have to do both at the same time, because if you just create a great athlete, then I think, like you said, Coach Nick, you almost lose the ability to maintain the structure that you need to throw a baseball hard, which is that stiff, keeping your weight on your backside, right? Where a lot of good athletes tend to be toe dominant. So that's something I think you have to consider along those lines.
Yeah, great point there. I mean, listen, I think we can all agree, though, athleticism in general is going to help us in terms of creating better motor patterning and coordination. Would anybody like to shed light on sort of what Coach Brett just brought up there and drop some different information or different take on your thoughts on different arm slots, and then what that could mean even taking it into long toss? Listen, I finished my career throwing sidearm. And actually submarine. When I would long toss, I would still long toss from like a 3/4 perspective, and still found benefits to doing it from that position. So I'm happy to hear anybody in terms of Joe and even Henry too, if you guys have ever felt that your arm slot changes while you're long tossing.
Yeah, it's usually when I try to like max effort, go past around that 300-foot mark. That's when like I could go a lot further than what I can do, but like I don't like doing that because like there's no point. It's like, yeah, it's great to like just let it eat, but if it's not helping me out and translating towards my mechanics, then it's like I really don't want to do it. There's no point. I think it's good to like get back because I like it how, like it'll make me like really like rotate back and really get that scap retraction and just have that whip. But You know, in terms of like, once I feel like my arm angle is starting to raise, it's like, all right, like that's kind of like my limit of like wherever I am today, like that's where I'm going to stop. But then as opposed to like when the pull downs though, from wherever I are, that's always when I try to have it the same arm angle. It's when I'm pulling down and bringing it in. That's when I feel very comfortable doing it. But like, once again, as we keep on saying, it's transferring that, like that little, like shuffle and then the throw. It's that I have a hard time with translating that motion and that art to the mound from a static point.
It's also interesting what he said too, that he feels it when he feels his arm angle raise is when he feels like he needs to stop. Whereas all the research shows that the further you get out, people's arm angles are actually dropping. So I just thought that was an interesting point to add
I
too.
guess that's why I'm me.
Dynamite drop in there, Joe. You know, I think also too, what's interesting is that we tend to know too that our arm might be even safer in that position than dropping there, and that tends to be the time that he ends up shutting it down. Does anybody have anything else that they'd really like to input in on this topic and discuss sort of with, you know, anybody that you know, might be listening to this in the future as to what they can take away from today and then bring into their plan? So far, it seems as though, you know, the varying the intensity is highly important. I think everybody's agreed with that point across the way. You know, not consistently going out and doing 100% on every single thing. You know, Rob, to your point there, we had a podcast 2 weeks ago with Richard James, who was a former Olympian, sprint and a track and field guy. And he said every single day his runners do something at 100%. And we were sort of blown away for a second. We were like, what does that mean? And what he then came in and said was, it doesn't mean that they're running a sprint 100% every day. But if we're going over technique, that's 100% that day that we're doing technique. And we can sort of relate that to maybe Joe's flat ground, right? His intent behind that flat ground is 100%, not necessarily how hard he's throwing, but his focus on what he's doing should be 100% that day on that topic. And that's what he's taken away from that practice. So I think undulating the actual intensity of which we're throwing is probably most important and paramount from this. What also it seems like has come into play is we probably need to have a little bit more education on what our lower half should be doing on these shuffles, as opposed to just allowing somebody to run in and toss, whereas we need this individual to maintain lower body mechanics similar to that of which that they'll pitch with. Robbie, did you want to come in with something?
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to the point I believe you mentioned earlier about the sole purpose of just being an athlete. And I know the context of this talk has purely been on long toss, but there's multiple different experts in this conversation, and I know we all bring interesting advice and experience and expertise on that. But the big thing I don't think we should lose sight of is just focusing on being an athlete as well, working on things of mobility, speed, agility, coordination, strength, power, and endurance, and just enhancing those areas of where you may have some deficits may in turn have a secondary effect of helping improve your long toss ability, your velocity, your sports performance. And so I don't think we have to always dive into sport specific advanced training, and sometimes just keeping it simple and working on the basic stuff can have also a positive output on performance as well. And the big thing, especially at the major league level, the course of a 162 game season, guys aren't going to feel like they do in April as compared to August. And the biggest thing with that is it's going to be a controlled fall. And now you working with your coaching staff, various outlets that are available, you want to control that fall as slow as possible. And so that's where I think you have to get very individualized in knowing what the appropriate long toss distance is for you, making sure that you're understanding your throwing mechanics and that you're not altering that, and also understanding what your workload for that day entails. And so I think that's where it goes back to a round of making sure you have intent with what you do. It doesn't always have to be exactly throwing, as you discussed, but or being on a pitching mound or flat grounds and things of that nature, but making sure that you're really specific with those details that can help get you through that course of a season.
Excellent. Excellent. Dr. Lund, why don't you have a very in-depth, procedure as to how you're prescribing long toss, right, with each player. And a lot of that is based on having a motus sleeve, well, seemingly all of it, right? And then obviously building off of what they've done the day prior and so on and so forth. What I think would be really great for everybody that would be listening to this is, how can they, if they don't have a motus sleeve, how can they manage their volume and create a program that is going to be tailored to themselves?
Yeah. So, for me, the three things I guess if I backtrack just a little bit, obviously I'm pro long toss. I think it does a bunch of things for you. Number one, it builds arm strength. It'll help you throw harder. I think it's actually a situation when long toss, and especially with guys that are coming back from surgery and they're doing their rehab protocol and then kind of bridge like the rehab into long toss, is like a perfect environment to change technique. Like for me, I've inherited some guys that, because I'm just a first year pitching coach, my first year at Iowa, and I inherited some guys that were coming back from surgery. And if you have surgery, like, you have to change something. That's kind of my rule, and I'm sure that's other people's rule as well. But I mean, if something went wrong like that, we have to change something. So doing a long toss routine, just the fact that it's progressive in nature and it's starting a low intensity and building up to high intensity, not only within a day, but across days and weeks and months even, that's a perfect environment for change. All that variability is, from a motor learning perspective, is perfect for cleaning up an arm action or cleaning up lower body mechanics, for example. But the third thing I think you get from long toss is fitness, right? And I think that's what you're talking to, and what I'll talk about next is the condition of the arm, like how much volume can the arm tolerate. And I think that long toss is wonderful for that. So for somebody that doesn't have a sleeve, it's really common sense stuff. You start low intensity and you build a high intensity, and you want to build those things progressively across days and then across weeks. And I would be remiss to not mention Alan Yeager and his program. I mean, Alan's year-long long toss manual, I was reading it again today. And anytime I get I just sent it to one of our junior college incoming guys. Anytime I get my hands on a guy and I've never worked with him, the first thing he does is start on page 30 on that year-long throwing program, read that section, and then do the first 6 weeks. I mean, that's it. I mean, it's a no-brainer. That program is tried and true. The volumes are appropriate. The buildup is appropriate. And even with a motus sleeve on, one thing I've learned was putting a motus sleeve on our guys every day. Just the fact that they know I'm watching, and we've put some basic constraints on them, like, again, high, low days, X number of days a week, and limit their throws. They will stay in a safe range. I don't even have to watch. We don't even need the sleeve. Just the fact that they're wearing the sleeve and they know that I'm watching and they're following the rules, they stay within those safe ranges.
Awesome. Excellent. So, and again, it's, I guess it's bringing us back to, and, certainly Alan Jaeger is the, godfather of long toss. And one of his, testaments that he is constantly alluding to is listen to the arm, and you'll be able to know exactly what you're supposed to be doing on a given day. And I think Joe probably uses that quite a bit as he goes through his plan, and and I know Henry probably now uses it quite a bit. Not going to go out and just obliterate yourself just because you have to stick to some really structured outline that you've created. And I think everybody else in this would agree that no matter what sort of protocol you're on, whether it's a return from throwing injury or whether it's a build up from something else, at the bare minimum, we must listen to what's going on in our body, and we must be vocal about what's happening, because if we're not, then we're just going to create similar issues that we got into in the first place, especially when coming off of injury. Does anybody have any last things that they'd like to bring to light about long toss, or about how people should be using it? You know, and you know, anything in that regard when referencing long toss. If not, I want to at least allow all of us to share the screen here and watch Henry's 101, just because the mechanics are quite intriguing in this. So I am going to share screen. And I believe now you can all see this. Yeah, you can see his video. Cool. Okay. So here we go. So we'll watch it full speed first. I don't think there's any curses in there. So here we go. We're going to come through and we're going to try and sneak a peek here. So first and foremost, just from my perspective and then everybody else, so we can take a look. Notice where he comes through with that arm. Dr. Lund, feel free to jump in too at any point. It seems as though right there we have the front side is probably fully loaded. Obviously, we're not having the greatest of views right now, but we're still got quite a bit of separation going on, back shoulder, back hip. And then as we come through with this, notice the angle that the shoulders get to. And his arm, what's really cool here to see is that the arm just tracks out, which is perfect right here, where I'm trying to slow it down. There you go. Where the elbow just sort of slingshots that ball out right in this position, which would be ideal. We would hope that every pitcher could have that similar scenario right there, where the elbow is just sort of slingshotting the hand and coming through off of that front side. Now, clearly, the momentum is quite impressive in this position, but notice how we're preloading our back hip right here. And if we were on the ground in that position, it'd be very interesting to see what that would look like. I know what his mechanics look like off the mound. He doesn't get into that position. He throws pretty straight up and down and then tries to just arm it to the plate. But that positioning right there looks very similar to most high velocity throwers. And it's just very intriguing to see that he struggles to get to that perspective on the actual mound. But I just thought it would be pretty cool for all of us to be able to share in that and view what something like that looks like, and how we can, really see that mechanics, maybe they don't really shift that much. It's just our inability to then transfer that. And a lot of that seems to be due to the momentum that we're carrying into it, and then having the ability to maintain similar pitching mechanics through that momentum, and hoping that then that would transfer. All right. If anybody doesn't have anything else, I think this was a phenomenal talk. Hopefully anybody who listened is getting a lot out of this. They can take away some of the long toss implements and start utilizing it in their throwing program. I thank everybody that came on, and we'll see you guys soon. Thank you again.